Okay, here we go. Go live.
Good evening, everybody, and happy Black History Month, and welcome to part 2 of Sones de Mexico Ensemble's roundtable discussion on the Black music of Mexico. Our goal today is to discuss the African root of Mexico and the profoundly significant role that Afro-Mexicans have played in the formation of contemporary Mexican identity, music, and art. Hey, Juan, you might need to put yourself on mute because we can hear you. Before we get started, I just want to give a few thank yous to some of the folks who made this possible. First and foremost, thank you to Juan Díes and to Sones de Mexico Ensemble for trusting me to talk on this presentation. Thanks to AARP Illinois, the Excellerator Fund, Latinos Progresando, and the Greater Auburn Gresham Development Corporation. My name is Dr. Eric Hines, and I've been a member of Sones de Mexico Ensemble since 2015, playing drums and percussion. And joining us today, we have two distinguished panelists that I would like to introduce. First is Dr. Carol Adams. Dr. Adams is former president and CEO of the DuSable Museum of African American History and former chairman of the African American Studies Department at Loyola University. And she spent much of her career engaged in cultural arts research, analysis, and production. Her unique perspective on art and its integral role in shaping and defining culture and community is informed by her parallel study of sociology and Africana history and culture. This study has included research trips to Costa Chica and Veracruz to study Afro-Mexican identity. Also joining us today is Dr. Elena Gonzales. Dr. Gonzales is curator of civic engagement and social justice at the Chicago History Museum, where she's curating Aquí en Chicago for 2025, and an exhibition that celebrates the historically persistent cultural presence of Latine communities in Chicago, from creating thriving Latine communities to proud displays of cultural heritage to public actions to abolish white supremacy. She has curated exhibitions since 2006, beginning at the National Museum of Mexican Art, where she curated Who Are We Now? Roots, Resistance, and Recognition, which traveled through 2011 as part of the larger project, The African Presence in Mexico. And as a matter of fact, I've got that book right here. This book is wonderful. It's a little bit hard to find, but you might be able to find a copy on eBay or if you dig around a little bit. But the African Presence in Mexico exhibit at the National Museum of Mexican Art really opened my eyes up to a lot of information that I was looking for when it comes to this subject. And Dr. Gonzalez's chapter in this book is phenomenal, and I couldn't be more excited that she's going to be sharing some of that with us today. Before we hand it over to our panelists, I have prepared a whirlwind history lesson. So I'm going to start out with that. I have a timeline of Afro-Mexican historical events, and we're going to try to breeze through this as quickly as possible. So hold on, because it's a lot of information in a short amount of time. We start with the first arrival of the Spanish in present-day Mexico. In 1517, Francisco Hernandez de Córdoba arrived in the Yucatan Peninsula. He was sent there by the governor of Cuba to capture and enslave native people to go to work in the Caribbean islands, and his men encountered the Mayans who defended their land. So he went back to Cuba and reported what he had found, and in response, in 1519, Hernan Cortés was leading an army into present-day Mexico, an army of 550 men, which included Spaniards, indigenous Cubans, and Africans. In 1521, the fall of Tenochtitlan happened on August 13th. Cortés's army symbolically and officially toppled the seat of the Aztec Empire in present-day Mexico City. In the fall of Tenochtitlan, at least 6 black men were among Spain's forces, and one of these men was Juan Garrido, who participated in the founding of New Spain as a free man. Having a little keyboard issue. So, starting in 1521, we have the arrival in bulk of African slaves to then New Spain. The abysmal decline of the indigenous population caused Spain to turn to Africa as a source of labor in agricultural, domestic, mining, and transportation industries. These first Africans who were brought as slaves to New Spain came from present-day Senegal, Gambia, and Guinea-Bissau. There were Afro-Mexican conquistadors that served in the Spanish companies in New Spain throughout the wars of conquest. One of them was Juan Valiente, who in 1533 negotiated out of slavery to become a conquistador and attained the rank of captain in the Spanish army. In 1595, a census recorded that Afro-Mexicans outnumbered both Spanish and mestizos in all urban areas of New Spain. By the 17th century, the Africans who were being brought to New Spain as slaves were now coming from West Central Africa, primarily from the regions of modern-day Angola. By the late 16th and early 17th centuries, Afro-Mexican participation in the Spanish military was significant. Researchers have documented over 500 Black conquistadors who helped establish New Spain. In 1609, a man named Gaspar Yanga was able to establish what is considered by many historians to be the very first free Black town in all of the Americas. This town was established in the mountainous regions of Veracruz. It was originally called San Lorenzo de los Negros, and it was renamed Yanga in 1932. Around that time, other cimarrones and palenques were being established in other parts of Mexico. A good number of Afro-Mexicans succeeded in establishing free settlements in remote, mountainous, rugged, hard-to-reach parts of the country, such as the mountains of Veracruz, Oaxaca, Guerrero, and the Costa Chica. By the mid-17th century, New Spain was home to the second highest number of African slaves and the largest free African descended population in all of the Americas. Most Spanish colonists used African domestic slaves in urban homes. Slaves were also used in the mines, ranches, and textile factories. In 1811, a man named Jose Morelos, an Afro-Mexican man, became the leader of the rebel army in the War of Independence. The town Morelia in Michoacan, his birthplace, and also the state of Morelos and other places are named for him. When he was executed, a man named Vicente Ramon Guerrero, a Black man born in the town of Tixtla in 1782, became the new commander-in-chief of the rebellion's military, Guerrero would go on to become Mexico's second president. In 1821, Mexico gains independence, and in that same year, the Mexican census prohibits including race or ethnicity. It was not included again until 2020. In 1828, Vicente Guerrero, that black man from Tixtla who led the rebel army, was elected second president of the Republic of Mexico. This spawned open warfare between liberal and conservative forces. Intervention was required from General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna to enshrine Guerrero's presidency. Guerrero became president on April 1st, 1829. After becoming president in September of that same year, Guerrero proclaimed a decree to end slavery in most of Mexico. Now, this was not made official by the Mexican Congress until years later. This was just a decree at this time, and it excluded some parts of Mexico, including the northern regions of Mexico that bordered Texas in the United States, and it also excluded the Istmo de Tehuantepec, where slavery did continue. Guerrero assembled a liberal government that championed the causes of racially and economically oppressed. On December 17th, 1829, Vicente Guerrero was ousted from power. His actions as president outraged Mexicans' conservative whites and ignited a rebellion that was led by Vice President Anastasio Bustamante. Open war broke out in the south of Mexico, and Guerrero was deposed while he was away rallying troops. He hid out in southern Mexico for just over 2 years before he was captured. On February 14th, 1831, Guerrero was captured and taken to Oaxaca, where he was tried by court-martial and he was executed by firing squad. In 1837 is when the Mexican Congress fully outlawed slavery in Mexico, 1837. So though Vicente Guerrero's decree ended it in most of Mexico, it was not made official by Congress until 1837. Now, from 1876 to 1911, we call this period the Porfiriato, where Mexico was ruled by Porfirio Diaz, and during his rule, he launched a nationalistic agenda that intentionally eliminated Afro-Mexican identity. The Mexican Revolution was spawned in reaction to Porfirio's leadership in 1910 and lasted until 1920. In 1920, after the Mexican Revolution, a man named Jose Vasconcelos was appointed Mexico's first Minister of Education. And I'm not going to talk more about him because I know that Elena has some information on him. So I'm going to pause right there with that history lesson. And I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Carol Adams, who has led some research trips to Mexico to visit the Costa Chica and Veracruz and observe the Afro-Mexican presence. So, Dr. Adams, you have the microphone. Welcome.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for including me. I want to apologize for the background noise because, you know, it's African American History Month, and us African American history professors get booked a lot. So I was double booked for tonight, and I'm at another event. So I thought I would be in a soundproof room, but you might get a little background. But I just wanted to say that as president of the DuSable Museum, I was there when the African Presence in Mexico exhibition had been started at the National Mexican Museum. It started there, it ended at DuSable. And we were so pleased to have it, and so pleased. We called ours From Younger to the Present because we wanted to capture all that meant, and we wanted to introduce both of our communities to their African heritage in a way that they had not been. I mean, I had people that I knew from all over come to this who had no idea about their own African heritage. And so we had also a conference for young people called The Third Root, where we talked about that root that is very rarely discussed, the African root. People talked about the indigenous and the Spanish root, not the African root. We know that Africans traveled even before slavery. And what's important to us too is our history doesn't begin with slavery. Our history begins far before that. And that the people who came were not slaves, the people who came were enslaved, but they were people who had skills, who brought those skills with them, who were able to work in the silver mining beyond the domestic work, in the horses and all kinds of things, and brought with them things that contribute to the African Mexican culture to this day. And you see it expressed in the culinary, you see it expressed in the music, in the beats and the roots of the music in particular. You know, the song Jarocho, I'm so pleased always. I didn't know when I was a teenager why I liked La Bamba. I found out later, okay? But we decided we would go, that what would be important for us was to take that trip and to go to Veracruz, to go to Costa Chica, to meet people and really experience this in a firsthand way. As in Brazil and other places, there were periods of time where the notion was, let's obliterate the African identity. Let's blend everything in, and let's say you're not African, you're Mexican, okay? And with language and all of that, that helps that to happen. So to see in later years, people want to resurrect the knowledge of who we are and all of our beautiful connectivity, and look at those influences and how we can use them to better appreciate ourselves and to educate our young people as well as our seniors. You know, when the exhibition came to DuSable, we did lots of events. We did events with congregations that would come together and mix and share this information. And it was very important for people to realize how much we've influenced each other. You know, that movement from San Lorenzo de los Negros to Yanga didn't just come automatically. It was fought for. And it was fought for to recognize the strength of the liberators. I can remember as a young African-American woman, all I was taught in school was, well, as a young African-American girl, was about slavery. I never knew that we existed before it. I didn't know anything about us in terms of civilization. I didn't know anything about us as where they found the first human beings, where man can begin. None of those things did I know. And that slavery narrative was an embarrassment to me because I wondered, why didn't we fight? Why didn't we fight back? So to find out about people like Yanga, to find out about the Palenques, and all of those things is very important to us because it teaches us that there was resistance, there were resistance movements, and that we really had a part in determining the cultural context of places all over the world, wherever we went. In all of this great diaspora, we are represented in many ways. So I love Sonia de Mexico for recognizing this and talking about it in your music, educating people through your music so that we recognize and appreciate our commonality, what that third root has meant all over the world, and how first people in third root ought to create something that's a much more just and equal society for us all.
Thank you so much, Dr. Adams. And before we move to the next topic, I want to provide an opportunity because I know because Dr. Adams is in such high demand that she might have to get off of the call before we finish. So I want to pause for a few minutes to see if anybody from the audience has any questions for Dr. Adams.
Yes, I would be glad to answer any questions people had. I had some pictures of us when we went to Mexico, but I got a new phone and it wouldn't let me send them to you, Eric, so that we could put them up. But what interested all of us was that when we all got together, we were indistinguishable one from the other. You know, and to visit the new museums, the Afro-Mexican Museum and what have you, was also very important for us. So any questions, I'd be glad to take them because I only have until 7.
Yeah, and I think if anybody has questions, you can unmute yourself and you can also type in the chat. I see a hand up from Teresa. Can you unmute yourself?
Yes, hi, good evening. Teresa Goodhue. I just wanted to share a little bit of history that I have through my mom, who is Lidia Guante, a former director of education at the National Museum of Mexican Art. I had an opportunity to go with her in 1997, I believe was the year, to Veracruz, and they took Muntu dance troupe with them, and they were participating. The dance group was participating in the Afro-Caribbean, like a dance and music festival that happened in Veracruz that year. And there was a playwright, and I'm sorry I don't remember his name, but he was there to do research, and then I believe he produced a play about Yanga's life and the community that was developed there. But I wanted to just say that one of the most memorable elements from that trip was to see the Muntu dancers recognizing the rhythms and some of the dance steps from the other Latino groups that were performing from like Central and South America. And I just, that always stuck with me as this, being able to see that those connections being made for us, right? Having a certain understanding, and then to be able to recognize how threads of your culture are interlaced through other communities, other places around the globe. And I just wanted to share that out with you all. Thank you.
Yes, because Muntu went on that very first trip as things were still being developed, research was being done and so forth. And it was very significant and important for them to see those connections and to be able to recognize them. And one of the things that impacted me when I went to Costa Rica was some of the culinary influences that reminded me of dishes that I had experienced in the South growing up and that I had seen in various other places throughout the diaspora, to see those things alive and to see that certain plants and certain other things and spices and traditions had also survived till this day.
Dr. Adams, can you tell us a little bit about that museum that you mentioned in the Costa Chica?
Well, it was a small museum that was sort of just a few years into existence when I came, but it was what many of these museums have been for us, and that is a liberation statement, because it was formed by people who really wanted to say, we will not let our history be obliterated. We will not let our influences go unrecognized and unattributed. So they talked about this whole history through some of which you reported in your earlier piece, the piece that got us started, when various politicians would decide to just obliterate this past and not speak of it. And so there were many, many decades where we were not counted at all. So where we went from being a significant part of the population, in some years being even more than the indigenous people in the locations, to being considered an infinitesimal amount when really the influences are still there. And of course, with all the scientific advances we have now, if people actually took the DNA test and the various things that are available to them, I think those numbers would swell.
Yeah, and that museum in the Costa Chica is named for Vicente Guerrero, and it is the
Yes.
only museum of Afro-Mexican culture in the world. Maybe one more question. I see Marta has your hand up.
Yeah, do you know if any of the peoples in the areas where the Africans were taken, if they're aware of the history, or does it talk there on that end?
Yes, there are some people who are aware. There are some places that we went that actually showed the ports where people came, where we were kept and held in the interim and so forth. So that it is known, it just needs to be more broadly discussed. I mean, we see even in America, things ebb and flow when it comes to telling the true history and what world history has been all about. We see now a whole new movement to repress much of this information, and so we've got to always really be on our case and make certain that we tell our stories. And storytelling is one of the most impactful ways. and then we integrate these things in our curricula and what have you. And then in our performances, we spend some time talking about how certain things came to be.
Yeah, I know, and that there's often knowledge of the North American slavery situation and coming from Senegal and so forth. But I was wondering about whether there's understanding about their going to Mexico and the Caribbean and South America. I didn't see that.
Very limited understanding of it. So we need to understand it more and more. In your major world history African American studies programs, we do study that because our diaspora is so great, we were distributed around much of the world. And because we were very early explorers, even before slavery, we went to various points in the world. We were navigators and sailors and what have you. People who came here were not people without skills. They were people who brought skills with them. They were able to impact agriculture and mining and animal husbandry and lots of crafts and other things. And so those influences need to be recognized and respected.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Adams. I'm so excited that you're here with us.
Thank you so much. And I'm a great admirer of your work. And I really love that you all are keeping this dialogue alive, because it's very important for us to constantly talk about and recognize these things, and to maybe do some other trips so people can go and see for themselves. Because the people we took with us from DuSable, this was their first exposure to this. And they were very amazed by the connectivity and the cultural connections that were very much in evidence in Veracruz and in Costa Rica.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time. I know how in demand you are, and we appreciate.
I'm so sorry, I really am.
It means so much to have your expert perspective in on this topic. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and have a great discussion.
You as well, Dr. Adams.
All right, bye-bye.
All right. We're going to pivot over to Dr. Gonzales now, who's going to talk, I believe, well, she can talk about whatever she wants, but I think maybe a little bit about the post-revolutionary erasure of Afro-Mexican identity.
Yes, I am. Thank you so much, Eric. And I just want to say, what an honor it was to share the virtual stage with Dr. Adams, and how kind it is for you and Juan and Sones de Mexico to invite me to be here this evening. It's a real pleasure to be with you all. So even though today I work at the Chicago History Museum, as Eric mentioned, we're going to go back in time a little bit for me, back to 2005, when I worked at the National Museum of Mexican Art, and we were preparing to open the exhibition, The African Presence in Mexico. And I want to note that this is something that was sort of brought up in Dr. Adams's remarks a little bit, but it was the work of the NMMA and their many partners at that time and in the decades prior, as well as the folks in Costa Chica and Veracruz, to suture Mexicanidad back together with its African roots, right? The understanding of what it means to be Mexican is intertwined with that African presence. And going back to the 90s, this was a topic that was really being embraced and fought for by the museum and by folks in Mexico. So at that time, I was on the committee to organize this exhibition, and I also curated the sister exhibition, Who Are We Now? Roots, Resistance, and Recognition, which was all about the relationships between Mexicanos and African Americans in the United States and between African Americans and the country of Mexico. So if you'd like to hear more about those projects, we can obviously talk about them today, but I also wrote about them quite a bit in my book, Exhibitions for Social Justice. But today, I'm going to talk about how the African presence was erased moving forward from that part of the Mexican Revolution. The first step, though, is we need to put on our African presence goggles. This is a beautiful portrait of the Soldadera de Michoacán by Agustin Casasola. It's an incredible photograph from the very start of the Mexican Revolution. This woman was a soldier, and the print is like nearly life size. And I remember back to when we were getting ready to open the African presence, Cesario Moreno, then who is a curator and visual arts director at the NMMA, said, you know, he had worked with this piece so many times before, but only when he put on his African presence goggles did he really see that this woman is Afro-Mexicana. And that opens her story to a whole new range of history, which is really exciting. So the Spanish used a system of racial profiling in the Americas called the casta system. And they had 16 different racial categories. The Portuguese had 20 some for Brazil, but these systems were very similar, and they basically showed how desirable it was to be Spanish and keep your pure Spanish identity, and how things could go wrong for you socially and economically when you started mixing with indigenous people and African people, people of African descent. So on the left here, you see the 16 castas, and on the right, you can see this sort of warning message to this Spanish gentleman about what happens when he enters into a domestic partnership with an African woman. He is at a lower economic status. There's strife in the household. He's not eating the red cuts of meat that the Spanish ate. He's eating more like the dishes that became the heritage of menudo and tripitas. And this casta story is going to come back in a moment post-revolution. So Eric kindly mentioned the Porfiriato. Basically, you have Porfirio Díaz, who's pictured here. He's a dictator for 34 years. And the overthrow of his dictatorship is the start of the Mexican Revolution, which is a war that lasts for 10 years. So you have to think about the disruption and the chaos in a society that has been in a dictatorship for a generation and then is hit by a 10-year war. At least 10% of the Mexican population died. 10 to 20% actually was gone at the end of the war because many people also fled Mexico. And in fact, that's the root of much of our sort of early Mexican population here in Chicago is folks who actually were fleeing the Mexican Revolution. And in fact, my own family falls into that category as well. And at the end of the war, you have the majority of the Mexican population is illiterate because not only of the way that Porfirio Díaz ran his dictatorship, but also the ravages of this war. And that sets us up for what happens next, which, as Eric was saying, is Jose Vasconcelos becomes the Minister of Education. And he was deeply racist, and he wrote this book, La Raza Cósmica, about the way in which the populations in Mexico were going to blend together to become this perfect bronze race, this cosmic race that was, taking all of the good qualities of indigenous populations and Spanish populations and bringing them together and ultimately purifying into this perfect race. But that notion of purification, of course, involves the elimination of the non-Spanish elements ultimately and the co-optation of the indigenous elements and sort of surreptitiously the African elements. So thinking back to the casta system, Vasconcelos said that Mexicanidad, being Mexican, is being mestizo, right? It's a mixture. And he used this term mestizo very carefully because that is actually one of the castas. When in the casta system, you have a Spanish person and an indigenous person come together, their child is mestizo. So mestizo means mixed, but mestizo also means this very specific union that is not African. And in that one word, and in creating this dynamic of Mexicanidad is mestizo, he effectively did this linguistic sleight of hand to erase that African presence. And then he hired the three great Mexican muralists, Diego Rivera, David Alfaro Siqueiros, Jose Clemente Orozco, to paint the walls of Mexico City with this story, right? This is Diego Rivera's incredible murals at the Palacio Nacional in Mexico City, which is enormous. And you can see like it actually extends onto the walls that we can't see on the right and left. This is a tremendous work of art. It's a narrative that shows the indigenous side, the Spanish side, the story of the revolution, but not that African piece. And that's not an accident. So Afro-Mexicanos played a key role in the war for independence, as we heard, and in the Mexican Revolution, as we heard. But by the end of the revolution, Mexicanidad actually did not include this idea of the Afro-Mexicano part. And Afro-Mexicanos helped build every mine and plantation in Mexico, every town, every hacienda, and they're still there today. So today, from the 1990s to the present, there's been a very strong resurgence of Afro-Mexicano identity and pride in that identity, like Dr. Adams was saying. On the right, this artist, Aide Rodriguez Lopez, is one of the artists in Costa Chica who's telling that story of what it means to be Afro-Mexicana. And then you've got African-American photographers from the United States, like Tony Gleaton, whose photograph is the black and white in the center, or Ron Wilkins, whose two photographs are the color ones on the sides, going to Mexico and having experiences like Dr. Adams described of searching for the African root, finding people, talking to people, learning about these histories that resonate with them, and actually having these really weird experiences where, like Tony Gleaton, for example, would talk to people and say, hey, this is amazing. I'm Black, you're Black, let's talk about this. And they would say, what are you talking about? We're not Black, we're Mexican. And that is the legacy of the process that Eric was talking about, where race was abolished from the census as part of the effort to abolish slavery and to abolish the casta system. But in fact, the casta system is actually alive and well in the experiences of racism that we find today in the pigmentocracy that still exists in Mexican society, both in Mexico and the United States. So when we were getting ready to open the African presence at the NMMA, Carlos Tortolero, one of the co-founding directors and of course president until last December, said to everyone, you know, every African American who comes into the museum needs to feel that we are so excited that we have the opportunity to welcome our long lost cousins to the museum. And this message really resonated across the museum in different families in different ways. And this is my family. This is on the left, my great grandma Rosa, and on the right, my cousin Sarah. And when I told my father about the history that we were telling, immediately he put on his African presence goggles, as so many people did at that time in the museum, and said, oh my goodness, your cousin Sarah is Black. And what he didn't mean, she identifies as Black, right? He meant, I'm looking through this lens and I'm seeing this history in our own family. And so our work today is to keep sharing this history and suturing Mexicanidad back together with that African presence. Thank you so much.
Wow, that was incredible. Thank you so much, Dr. Gonzales. You know, my head is spinning. That was just so well outlined. And by the way, before I forget, I also wanted to mention, you know, Dr. Gonzales mentioned Cesario, who was one of our panelists at part 1 of the Black Music of Mexico, which if you want to view that and you weren't present for that, lives on Sones de Mexico's YouTube channel. And I'm embarrassed to have to follow that. But what I'm going to try to do is tie this in a little bit to music. So I'm going to take about the next 10 minutes or so to talk a little bit about how we can observe the African presence in Mexican music, and then we're going to open it up for questions for the remainder of the session. So one of the things that Dr. Adams mentioned and that Dr. Gonzales mentioned is the contributions that exist in the fabric of the Mexican identity that you cannot remove. Even if you don't talk about them, they're always there. It's in the cuisine, it's in the fashion, it's in so much of the culture. And Dr. Adams pointed out how the Africans who were brought to Mexico were skilled, and they brought with them these skills. And one of the major skills that was brought that can be observed everywhere in the African diaspora is music. And one of the most particular elements of Mexican music and all music throughout the African diaspora is dance and rhythm, along with call and response and other elements. In the last segment, in part one, we talked about this duality of meter that is present in all different forms of Mexican music. Today, I would like to zero in on one specific form of music that has clear African antecedents. So first of all, let's take a look at our map. We are going to go here. If you can see my mouse, this is the border of Guerrero and Oaxaca. And there's a small beach here that's called the Costa Chica. And it's in this region, and also over here in this region, where we find today the most identifiable presence of Afro-Mexican culture, even though it exists all throughout Mexico. But these are the regions where these palenques and cimarrones were established back in the 1600s. These free towns that were established by runaway slaves or Africans who refused to be enslaved. So even to this day, when you go to these remote, very difficult to reach parts of Mexico, you will find communities of people who look very Afro-Mexican, and even in the Costa Chica identify as Afro-Mexican, which is very different from the rest of the country. And this region here, my friend Irecani, who's also a member of Sones de Mexico Ensemble, has been here, and he attests at how difficult it is to get there. Like just driving there today, there are no roads that are easy to navigate. There are certain areas that you can't walk around without a machete because of the crocodiles that are lurking around. So these are still very remote, isolated regions. And one of the styles of Mexican son that Sones de Mexico performs and talks about that comes from this region is a style that's called the son de artesa. And Dr. Gonzales actually had a nice painting of the son de artesa in her presentation. And as a matter of fact, and this was not planned at the beginning, the video that Juan put together had a performance of son de tarima, which comes from the son de artesa. So I would like to talk a little bit about that. And I've put together some videos that kind of show you the evolution of the son de artesa. Now, it originated in this region. I don't think anybody knows when it originated, but everybody pretty much agrees that it is absolutely an African art form, an Afro-Mexican art form. And the son de artesa, the artesa refers to a canoe that would be turned upside down and danced on with bare feet. So the canoe actually becomes a drum that you play with your feet. And it's that dance and rhythmic connection that has such a strong pull towards African tradition. And together with that, we have some other percussion instruments and singing and dancing and some melody instruments. So let's take a look at a little bit of some traditional son de artesa. Now, if you look at this artesa, this is typical. You have a horse's head and a horse's tail. And many believe that the reason for that is that the Afro-Mexicans were celebrating their freedom, and they were creating the artesa to represent something Spanish that they could dance on top of. So it represents the animals of the Spaniards. Let's watch and listen to a little. going to pause for just a second here. Now you can see in these percussion instruments, in addition to the artesa that's danced on and drummed with the feet, you also have this instrument here, which is a cajon. Sometimes that's referred to as the cajon de tamboreo, the cajon that you drum on, and it's played with the open hand and with a stick or sometimes a wooden block in the other hand. It could also be played with two hands. There's not one definitive way to play this instrument or one definitive rhythm on it. It's different from player to player, but there are commonalities here. And you also have this long piece of bamboo that's filled with seeds, which is called huacharasca. And the rhythms that are being played both by the feet of the dancers and on the cajon are in that duality of meter that we talked about in part 1 of these talks. It's in 2 and it's in 3. It's simple and it's compound. Café con pan is inside of this rhythm. So listen a little bit more and then I'm going to play a couple other examples. Okay, now I'm going to pivot to my second example. And I tried to put these kind of in like evolutionary order. So the more traditional examples first, and then you can see how this style has grown into a national style.
Y otras que venían de otras partes se me iban a ver allí como nosotros andamos bailando y los regalaban buenos regalos. Buenos regalos.
I'm going to skip ahead a little bit.
A Cruz Grande con las demás comunidades, ¿no?
Okay, now a lot going on here. Now this, what you're seeing in the earlier part of this video, you see the bare feet on the artesa, and I've actually also read that sometimes you would be a trench dug in the ground or in the sand with a board laid over the trench, and then the dancing done on the board. It's almost like an earth drum that's being created. Now this style that you're seeing here is when you get out of the rural coastline and more towards the town of Tixla. And in the more urban centers, you'll start to see that this style is danced with a hard-soled shoe, and it has a little bit more of a flamenco, traditional element added to it. It's starting to be morphed a little bit. But then you also see, this is La Iguana, which is one of the most famous songs in this style, where the dancers are imitating different animals and the movements of animals. And many times a handkerchief is employed by the dancers. In La Iguana, sometimes a handkerchief is put in the mouth of the male dancer and it looks like the red tongue of the iguana. So you start to see the difference between the original style and the rural style, and then a more contemporary style, which starts to evolve into a national style of this tradition that is sometimes referred to as the son de tarima. The tarima is the term for the wooden box that's typically danced on with the hard-soled shoes, the Mexican tap dancing that's observed in a lot of folklorico dancing. So now, let me move to our next video. Here we have another artesa.
Negra chula preciosa, quiero perderme en tu cuerpo, mi capullito. Bailamos y te verás más golosa.
Typical for 3 dancers to dance on the artesa. Okay, next we have So we see some different styles and techniques of playing the cajon, a combination of hands and sticks. Now here's son de tarima. We have the harp now. Okay, and then using a cajon that you sit on, more like a Peruvian style cajon. The similar rhythms from the previous example. Okay, and then finally, the stage version. Okay, so you see how it evolves and it becomes more of a nationalistic style. And if you were to see the last version without seeing the previous versions, you might have no idea how Afro-Mexican this started out. Now, the main rhythm that you're hearing, I'd like to demonstrate the way that we perform it with Sones de Mexico Ensemble. I'm going to move to the cajon. So typically, we will perform with a cajon like this. Sometimes we'll perform with the more traditional instruments, but the rhythm that's being played percussively at least our interpretation of it, which we heard on some of those videos, sounds a little bit like this. And some variations on that. And what that is really in its essence is café con pan. Café con pan, café con pan, café con pan. Café con pan, café con pan. So you see, it has that duality, the 3 against 2. And it's also one of my favorite styles of music that we play because it does have such a specific swing to it. It has a feel that's very specific that you don't find in a lot of other forms of Mexican folk music. Okay, so before we run out of time, I want to make sure we have some opportunity for some question and answer. I have a question for Dr. Gonzales, and then we can open it up for everybody. I've been thinking, now that we've just talked about some music from the Costa Chica, there's a style, an umbrella label that we put over music from the Costa Chica that we call the chilenas. And what that refers to is this origin story in which there were miners, black miners from Chile, who were making their way up to California during the gold rush in the 1840s. And these miners came to the Costa Chica, and some of them stayed there. And what they brought with them was their Afro-Chilean music and their Afro-Chilean culture. And that's often used as an explanation for why there's so much Afro-Mexican music and culture observable in that part of Mexico. So that's an origin story that would start in about 1849 or maybe a little bit sooner than that. But what I think about is when we think about the history that we talked about at the beginning of this presentation, that you have had a strong Afro-Mexican presence, particularly in that part of Mexico that goes back to the 1500s. So that's like 300 years before this origin story comes along. So I'm not saying that the Chileans didn't come to Costa Chica. You know, they likely did, and they likely did bring some of their traditions with them. But, you know, who knows what happened. What I would speculate, though, is that that part of Mexico was already very heavily Afro-Mexican. And maybe those Afro-Chileans found some commonalities with that part of Mexico. And that's why there was such a resonance that happened between those groups. And what I noticed is that using that as an origin story, you kind of hear that typically throughout other parts of Mexican culture to explain how could there be something so African in this country. I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on that, Dr. Gonzales.
Yeah, I think, you know, first of all, I love the music piece. I just have to say that. Thank you so much for that, because that is really such a tangible example. But I think you're absolutely right on about the timing of these things. I'm also not saying Chilenos didn't come through in that time period, not at all, you know, although I don't know as much about that history. But you have to remember that the Spanish were, you know, enslaving African people hundreds of years prior, and that both enslaved and free African people were working all over Mexico for hundreds of years prior, and, you know, having families, having children, that population is growing. And in fact, the Spanish were a ruling minority when they colonized Mexico. emphasis on the word minority, because you have the indigenous population and you have the African population becoming, you know, Afro-Mexicano population. And so things like the casta system were designed to control and drive a wedge between to drive a wedge between groups that put together could become a majority. So it's like we see in, you know, politics in the United States today and in you know, the past number of decades, when we see Latinos and African Americans being driven apart by particular political factions, what we're seeing is this wedge politics. And so the Spanish were playing that same game. And I think that speaks to the numbers right there.
Wonderful. Do we have questions from the audience? I know we're about out of time, but I think we can go maybe a few minutes more if you guys would like to ask some questions to Dr. Gonzales or anything about the music we talked about.
I see a question in the chat that I'm just barely getting a chance to read. What are our goals for suturing together the African roots to Mexicanidad? So I appreciate that so much, that question, because this was the actual purpose of the sister exhibition to the African Presence in Mexico that I worked on at NMMA, which is to say the steering committee of the African Presence project as a whole, which I was a part of, as I mentioned, wanted to have an exhibition that dealt with these relationships in the United States, particularly because they wanted to bring home the point that Mexicans and African Americans can be a majority when we work together and can get a lot done when we work together. That was instrumental. It was a utilitarian move to create that exhibition in the first place. And so we were able to build the idea of this coalition politics, which is not new, but needs refreshing every now and again, right? So we were able to build this idea through bringing out some of the deep histories that that these two groups share. For example, the Underground Railroad going to Mexico, right? Not many people know that story, but when we start hearing about that, it's like, okay, people had to collaborate very, very closely to be successful in that endeavor. And like 100,000 people in the South who were enslaved during the generation when Mexico was free and the United States was not, sought freedom in Mexico. That just makes sense. So I think, I'm not sure if that's precisely an answer, but I think the shorter answer is intersectionality is real. We shouldn't be putting people in little boxes, and we should instead be really bringing out these stories that bring us together. It's very powerful when we can have that experience of embracing a history that brings us together with other people rather than division.
Jeff Zahos, did you raise your hand? I thought I saw a hand come up.
I did, just for a second.
Did you have a question, Jeff?
Yeah, so I'm basically just wondering about how, because I'm in America and I'm a musician, I think about ways that that Black culture in the United States has really, particularly in music, really had a huge influence within popular music in particular, and even risen to like real prominent, I mean, not just prominence, but like massive popularity and massive cultural influence and that kind of thing through, you know, decades, many decades, if not centuries. So I'm just wondering if, and I have to say that this is the first time I've ever really even scratched the surface of Mexico's history with African people and slavery in particular. And I'm just wondering, you know, has there been similar type of like influence in popular music and popular culture in Mexico as the same way that has been in the United States, or has it been different? And yeah, I guess I'm just coming at it as like a very American-centric view and wondering how things relate.
Yeah, that's a great question, Jeff. Thank you very much. And I think it can be difficult because, you know, we think of race relations in the United States through the experience of the United States, and is not the same as the experience in Mexico. In the United States, we had a civil rights movement. In the United States, we had very clearly defined Jim Crow laws and segregation, whereas the narrative in Mexico and the history has been so different. It's really just kind of been rewritten to eliminate and deny the existence of an African identity in Mexico. But of course, it's always been there. So the challenge now, and really I think the inspiration for starting this series of conversations, is that in contemporary Mexico and contemporary the United States, it's not apparent where these African influences are, but they're there. They're in every aspect of Mexican culture, but it really hasn't been documented. It hasn't been written about. The identity hasn't been acknowledged. It hasn't been recorded in the census for so long. And so the idea is that everything in Mexico is Mexican, and not necessarily pointing out, well, this is African and this is Spanish and this is indigenous. And what I am looking for is, especially in the regional folkloric music of Mexico, what are those elements that are clearly identifiable as being African contributions? Because everything in the identity of Mexico and in art and culture, you name it, is some degree of those three roots. The story of Mexico is those three roots. Obviously, the Iberian, Caucasian, the indigenous populations, of which there are many throughout Mexico, and the African population, of which there are many throughout the history of Mexico. It's just that that one root has been ignored for so long that we have to really start digging to find out about it. And to be honest, there's some political resistance to that digging. So it's a challenging topic, but I think it's a very important one. Dr. Gonzales, do you want to add anything to that?
I was just popping it in the chat, but basically, you know, there was an official acknowledgement on the part of the Mexican government in the 90s saying, you know, we acknowledge the African presence in Mexico, basically. And that paradoxically, the 400 years of intervening time is both the time in which the African presence appeared to disappear within Mexican identity and the time in which it became completely pervasive. So it's interesting to me how something can be at once everywhere and in certain ways invisible, even though to someone from the United States, it's staring you right in the face.
Maybe we've got time for one more question, and then we've got to wrap it up.
I see Alba has her hand up.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for the opportunity. My name is Alba. I'm from Veracruz, Mexico, specifically in the south, in Ángel Recabada. So from that region of the Los Tuxtlas, Santiago San Andrés Tuxtlas. And when you guys play all these songs, it really touched me because I was born and raised over there and listening to this music. And at schools, they teach us this music all the time because it's part of the, you know, the school system. You have to learn the dances. You have to learn the music. Unfortunately, when I moved here when I was 15 years old, and I say unfortunately because I didn't have identity over there. So I realized and I learned where I was from when I was out of the country. You know what I mean? I learned that I have this, whatever you guys mentioned, the Tor roots on me, which is all that we were talking about today. And then I learned that how history is being erased ignored, discriminated, and repressed, a repressed community where I'm from. And still people don't know there in that area where we come from. So it's a lot of ignorance, I'll say that. But these sessions are very important to me, and it touched me very strong because you guys talking about my community, you guys talking about my hometown area, and it's very important to show the community here, because a lot of kids, I'm pretty sure they're African descendants and they being discriminated just for being indigenous, because that's what they do over there. There's a lot of discrimination. There's a lot of racism also in Mexico. Colorism, that's where I grew up, and the family also. And it's sad. And we need to bring this to the community and teach them where they're coming from. And I love the music. It's one way to approach to the people, to let them know where they're coming from, or what we are in reality. So this is very, very, very nice session. I love it, and this is my second time attending, and I would love and looking forward to have more. Right now in my state in Veracruz, we have only one politician. His name is Eric Cisneros Burgos. He's called himself an African descendant, and it's the only one in the state. I never heard this before, of people that it's African descendant, that it's doing this movement in Mexico, and specific in the state of Veracruz. So he wrote a book called Negritud. So I recommend it. It's the only person, like I said, that I know that it's saying this. It's speaking up about African, Mexican, Afro descendants. So thank you very much.
Oliva, it's so touching to hear you say that. Thank you so much for sharing. And that's really the whole point of putting this together. I'm sorry that we didn't talk about music from Veracruz today, but perhaps in part 3 of this discussion, we can go to Veracruz and talk about the very strong Afro root to that culture in music, which is, along with the Costa Chica, the most observable African identity in the country. Okay, well, on the theme of Veracruz, I'd like to close today, but before I do, I want to give a huge thank you to Dr. Gonzales. Thank you for giving your time and for your wonderful presentation and for your amazing research. I hope everybody comes to check out your exhibit at the Chicago History Museum and continue doing all of that great work. And I look forward to staying in touch. And also, I want to say thank you to Dr. Carol Adams for her wonderful perspective and for taking the time to be with us today and to answer some questions. And thank you to Sones de Mexico as well. And I will close on the theme of Veracruz with a quote that comes from an unknown Jarocho musician. Now, Jarocho, if you don't know, means from Veracruz. And the quote is, "The African presence in Mexico is like sugar in coffee. It can't be seen, but it improves the flavor." And on that note, thank you all so much for being here, and we'll catch you at part 3. Have a great night.
Thank you so much here. Bye, everybody. Thank you so much.